Okay, Seth, shall we?
Yes, thank you. Hi, I'm Seth Godfrey. I'm Manager of Reference Adult Services at the New Haven Free Public Library. And I'm very thrilled to be here tonight and welcome everyone. Thank you, Professor Jacobson, Professor Feimster, for this great conversation this evening. This has been a great collaboration. It's our 4th year. Unfortunately, fortunately, it is virtual. It's the reality of the day. We look forward to the day we are in person. And I welcome everybody who, if you live in New Haven, please get a library card. We're very fortunate to have a copy of Professor Feimster's book, Club and Horrors. So please check it out, join us, and we welcome you at the library. We are open for business. And thank you, Professor Jacobson.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Seth. Let me begin with a couple of thank yous. Thank you. This collaboration with the New Haven Free Public Library has been really important to us here in Public Humanities. So I want to thank our colleagues there, not only Seth Godfrey, who's here with us on screen, but Marian Huggins, Luis Chavez Brumel, Rory Morderana, and Isaac Shub, and thanks to the entire staff over at the New Haven Free Public Library. Thanks to my colleague Karen Rothman, who has done so much for Public Humanities and for this series, and to Jake Gagne, who is our associate working behind the scenes tonight, hard at work on the back end of the webinar. Thanks so much, Jake, for the work you do. One program note, our next program, usually we're spaced out by 3 or 4 weeks, but our next program is actually next Tuesday, February 22nd. We have Laura Briggs from UMass Amherst. She'll be speaking on her work, How All Politics Became Reproductive Politics. This comes from a brilliant book of hers. Brilliant not only on reproductive politics, as you might glean from the title, but really at a much broader take on the politics of care under neoliberalism. So I hope you'll join us again next Tuesday. Tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome my colleague, Crystal Feimster. Crystal took her PhD at Princeton, and she taught at Princeton, at UC Chapel Hill and Boston College before joining the faculty here at Yale, where she now teaches in the departments of African American Studies and History and the programs of American Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Feimster has received numerous teaching and mentoring awards. She's been a faculty fellow at the American Academy of Arts Science in Cambridge, the Du Bois Institute at Harvard, the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Feimster's first book, which Seth just showed you, Southern Horrors, Women and the Politics of Rape and Lynching, is a history of how Black and white women in the US South were affected by and responded to the problems of rape and lynching in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Southern Horrors won the Northeast Black Studies Association's W.E.B. Du Bois Book Prize. Her many articles have appeared in venues like the Journal of American History and Daedalus. She edited a special issue of the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on the centennial anniversary of women's suffrage, and has written numerous book chapters and encyclopedia entries, and has published in the New York Times, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and Slate. She's also advised and appeared in several documentaries, including The Rape of Recy Taylor. Tonight, we'll be hearing about Feimster's soon-to-be-completed work, Truth Be Told, The Battle for Freedom in Civil War-Era Louisiana, a case study that centers Louisiana as part of a formative moment in the emergence of new ideas about freedom and citizenship in America. We've long been familiar with the genre of the slave narrative, the most famous being those by Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, but Feimster now urges us to attend to the freedom narrative, as we will do tonight. Professor Feimster, welcome.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for having me. And thank you, Seth Godfrey, for co-hosting this event, and Jake for taking care of all the details and making sure that I unmute and all of those things. So, and of course, Matt, I'm looking forward, as always, to our conversation.
Likewise, likewise. So just to start us out, I mean, this is an epic book. It's epic in scope and scale. I guess I don't need to tell you that, you're the one who's writing it. but it's also epic in your archival efforts to really tell an emancipation story from below. It's really quite unusual in that way. So to start us off, can you just give us an overview of this story, this very unusual story that you're piecing together in Louisiana?
You know, it's interesting to hear you call it epic, especially because it started out as a case study, really looking at like where the book actually is going to end up at a mutiny at Fort Jackson during the American Civil War. And what I realized is I was really trying to unpack this case in which Black soldiers, Black regiments out of Louisiana serving in the Union Army mutinied against their white officers. And for a host of reasons, one in part because they were being racially brutalized and beaten, also as protests against the Black women who were serving as laundresses, who were being sexually harassed and violated. And it was really part of another project on sexual violence. And what I realized pretty quickly as I tried to make sense of what was happening was I didn't know anything about Louisiana. I mean, that's basically, I was like, well, wait a minute, who are these Black soldiers and where do they come from? What is the Native Guard? I'm really trying to track a longer history and realizing that Black men in Louisiana had a kind of long military history going back before the Louisiana Purchase under the French and the Spanish, trying to get my mind around the free Black people who came from Cuba via Haiti, and that there was this longer history that I really didn't understand. And I wanted to think about Louisiana as a place where enslaved people were trying to imagine and redefine freedom in the context of the Civil War, around the question of sexual and racial violence. And then I was like, oh, wait a minute, all Black people ain't slaves. There's this long history of free Black people. And I wanted to understand how in this state, a Southern slaveholding state that had the largest population of free Black people, how people understood freedom, how they understood citizenship in the decades before the Civil War. So then I could understand how they were trying to redefine it in the context of the war. And also in the aftermath of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, in which enslaved people in Louisiana are emancipated because of by 63, Louisiana is, Southern Louisiana has proven its loyalty to the Union and held elections. And the Emancipation Proclamation only frees enslaved people in the rebellious states. Southern Louisiana is no longer considered part of the rebellious states by December of 62. So it became a big project, right? So, and the historian that I am, the more I went into the archives and the more I found, particularly about the Native Guard and Black soldiers, the more I realized I didn't know. And the further back I had to go to understand. So the project, when I hear you say epic, I think, why am I starting it? It's epic because I'm starting in 1803, right? And where I thought I was starting in 1864. So again, it's a bigger project in which I have come to think about Black freedom as a category that we haven't fully reckoned with in the antebellum period. Right, in a slaveholding society, and what it meant for enslaved people to live alongside not just free Black people, but elite and educated and well-off Black people. So really trying to understand that at the same time, as a student of Nell Painter, who always says, what about the White people? You can't just talk about Black people. Right, really trying to get a sense of how white people understood freedom, how they resisted notions and ideas about Black freedom and how Black people imagine their freedom. And so oftentimes when we're looking at that intersection of how Black people imagine freedom and how white people are imagining freedom, the slave narrative kind of sits at that intersection.
Mhm, mhm.
And we've got Frederick Douglass, we have Linda Brandt, sort of articulating, or even 12 Years Slave, right? Articulating this idea that Black people want to be free. Black people know what freedom is, and as soon as they can seize it, they're going to take it. And that there's this idea that the slave narrative, I think, reinforces this idea that freedom is about escaping the slaveholding South, right? That it is a point, is a destination moving to a free state. And one of the things that I've come to think about is that Black freedom can exist within the confines of slavery.
Mhm.
What do I mean by that? You know, in terms of identifying what I'm calling freedom narratives, is the ways in which Black people, free and enslaved, imagine their freedom and exercise freedom, right? So that we know, because of Stephanie Camp, that Black people ran away all the time. They didn't always run north, but they ran away as a form of not just resistance, but I argue as a way of renegotiating the power relations within a slaveholding household. Right. So part of the trick for me in this book is to identify enslaved people, free Black people, and white people who held people in bondage, and kind of try to tell their stories simultaneously, right?
Mhm.
To see how they're dreaming about freedom, exercising and practicing what I often say that they're often practicing. And what we see in Louisiana that I think is important, is that there's a kind of rehearsal. And I pull back from that language a little bit because I love it, because Willie Lee Rose's work, and sort of being the historian, I have to say, well, okay, Sea Islands wasn't the place, but Louisiana was the place where we had the rehearsal for Reconstruction. And now I think I'm more invested in the idea of thinking about what Black freedom looked like in the antebellum period, that this wasn't a rehearsal, that this was indeed a vision.
Mhm.
And it's a vision that comes to fruition for a lot of Black people and states after the Civil War. But that in fact, a lot of the things that get debated and argued and fought about after the war were being argued and fought about and debated in Louisiana on the ground before. So free Black people were already making the case that they wanted the franchise. They wanted to vote in that 1862 election, right? At the Louisiana Purchase, they were making the argument that they were citizens, and that as Louisiana was being brought into America, that they were citizens and should have the same rights. Already making those arguments that we see come to fruition with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment.
Right. So, can you, this is so fascinating to me. Can you talk a little bit about that formulation of yours, freedom narratives? Because in some sense, it's kind of metaphorical in the sense that it describes a congeries of different kinds of sources and articulations that you're packaging and you're unearthing and kind of packaging together under this one rubric. On the other hand, it's quite literal in the sense that they are narratives about, it's that vision, it's the political vision that you're talking about. Can you talk a little bit about where you're finding the pieces of this story, and how the work that you're doing in piecing together a kind of collective political project called Citizenship in this moment before citizenship was available?
I wish, Matt, I could say to you, oh, this all came out of, you know, at the end of the day, I completed all my research and I could put the puzzle together. And I was like, oh, look, this is what a freedom narrative is. But I think very much like my first work, I let Ida B. Wells kind of define and dictate the arguments that I was going to make. And late in the game with this project, you've read a piece of my work on Jordan Noble. Late in the game, I decided that I wanted one of the characters that I wanted to follow through the book was a soldier who had, I should say he's a drummer, a military drummer who had allegedly beat his drum for Jackson in the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. He is going to fight in a couple more wars. He's known as the veteran drummer of New Orleans. He musters in a regiment of Native Guards during the Civil War for the Confederate Army. He then musters in under the Union Army when the Confederates flee and New Orleans falls. And so he was somebody that I could pull all the way through. But when I started reading about him, because he's very well known in New Orleans, there was, nobody wanted to talk about the fact that he was enslaved, right? And nobody was interested in figuring out, like everybody accepted that he was born to an enslaved woman. And that at some point when he was a child, they were sold. Well, they don't often say he was sold. They say they moved to Louisiana, and he enlisted in Jackson's 7th Regiment. And they say he had slave parentage. He was, but nobody knew when he was emancipated, right? So they often say, oh, I think he might have been, if he in fact was a slave, he was emancipated probably after the Battle of 1815, because, he had served Jackson. And he's celebrated. And I thought, well, he's a good character to follow through. But as I began to research him, I found out that it was a more complicated story. And that the story that people tell about him is in fact the story that he wanted them to tell. Right, that he's not emancipated until 1837. So he does serve, but he's impressed into service as an enslaved child. And he's sold multiple times. He's the center of a Supreme Court case where somebody wants to claim him from, but in none of his public appearances. In the 1850s, he decides that he wants to traffic in the narrative of freedom and the Battle of 1815, and that he's gonna position himself at the heart of sort of American ideas about freedom. He doesn't talk about his enslaved past. He really tries to move into the free Black community of elite Black people, right? And tries to position himself as always being free. And he does it for a host of reasons, in part because he's free and he wants to, he wants to imagine himself as always being free, but he understands the leverage that he has, in part because he's able to argue for pensions later on. The enslaved men who are impressed into service in the War of 1812, the Battle of 1815, can't get pensions, right? And he wants to make an argument, and he has to say that he was free when he served in that battle. But he's also doing a host of things. He's complicated. Once he does get his freedom, he actually purchases an enslaved man. Right. And so looking and trying to understand how he's imagining his own freedom. And it's a hard story to tell because he's not Frederick Douglass. Let me be clear, right? And that he understands by the 1850s that his freedom is very fragile, and that he has to shore it up, and that he understands the discourse of freedom and American freedom. He understands how that's connected to military service, how that allows him to make citizenship claims, right? So in some ways, when I started to read his narrative and like to understand it and find him in the archives actually quite easily, which made me wonder, like, well, why haven't people in New Orleans challenged this narrative, right? And I think for a couple of reasons, in part because it's so neatly packaged. He left a public record that makes it really hard to counter. Unless you're willing to go into the archives and look for the look for the records, the notary papers that are being signed and stamped. And I think there is a way in which, very much like slave narratives, we want to honor the stories that people tell about their captivity and their freedom. And I want to do that. And so I thought for me to be able to do that, then I have to embrace a different kind of framing of naming what he's doing, right? That he is narrating his freedom. And he's imagining it. And then once I was able to sort of put him in that frame, it meant that when I went back to think about my other players, right? And most of my Black subjects aren't leaving diaries. They haven't written post-war memoirs or pre-war memoirs for that matter. What I am doing is going into military records or going into family papers and reading against the grain in some cases, where white families are talking about how Black people are enacting freedom in a sense, even though they see it as resistance, they see it as all of these other things, right? And what I see is Black people making claims on their labor and their time, making exercising freedom around their rights as parents, as husbands and wives, and articulating that, right? In terms, when I read how white people are writing about it, I'm like, oh, they saying, you know what, work day is over. I'm going to the other plantation. I'm going to see my wife, and that there's this constant negotiation that's happening, right? And so that Black people are narrating their freedom in their actions, and that we have to be prepared to read those narratives and read them anew, and not just as resistance, but as actually envisioning and exercising freedom in the context of bondage.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to ask you exactly about that, because words like resistance and agency have existed in the scholarship for a couple of generations now, but never quite as pointedly about freedom and citizenship in the way that you're talking about it. Can you talk about, I mean, you've given us a lot in terms of, tracing the drummer and kind of thinking about how he was narrating his freedom, but can you talk a little bit more about your own kind of dawning consciousness that there is a difference between what a generation ago historians would call resistance and what you want to call enacting freedom?
I mean, I think, it's I think it's a part of a term, right? Within the historical profession, within Black studies more generally, in terms of how we want to think about the lived experiences of Black people, right? That there has been this shift, not just to see, even in the language, right? So we no longer, we're not supposed to say slaves. I mean, I do sometimes, don't get me wrong, but the language has shifted to talking about enslaved people, right? And that if we just turn the language, like I always tell my graduate students, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be this dramatic shift. But if we just turn our angle of vision just a little bit, if we turn from slave to enslaved, right? What does it allow us to see about the people that we're writing about, right? That we see them as not just captive, right? Not always resisting and always responding, but actually dictating the terms of their lives under a system that is set up to limit the possibilities of family, of kinship, of their reproductive rights, and a host of things. And that Black people aren't walking around going, I'm a slave, right? That they actually see themselves in roles, right, as mothers, right? And we can write about them as enslaved mothers and talk about the limits that slavery puts on what's possible for them, but they are actually carving out and defining. And I often argue, and I did this with Wells, that they are expanding these categories, right? In the way that they practice and imagine freedom, right? So for enslaved Black women, who someone like Celia a Slave, who many people are familiar with, that I argue that, you know, in her actions, in her violent self-defense of herself, she's making a claim about a woman's right to consent and to self-defense. It's a claim that white women have a really difficult time making and articulating, right? So one of the things that I try to map is that Black women, through enslavement, through freedom, are trying to redefine the category of citizenship, right? And equal protection under the law to include sexual sovereignty, right? And what does the sexual citizenship look like? So in this case, I'm trying to say, well, if we imagine freedom through the eyes of Black people, how does it expand the category of freedom, instead of thinking, okay, if we imagine Black people only through the lens of enslavement, they're forever slaves resisting. So I think, you know, I'm at a moment where, you know, people like Saidiya Hartman, for example, who engage in critical fabulation and speculation. You know, I feel like I don't have limited, my sources aren't limited. I have so many sources. And so, but her speculation and the way that she imagines the fullness of Black life means that when I go into the archive and I'm looking at sources, whether I'm reading against the grain or just reading for understanding of what Black people and white people are doing in these houses, in these households, and that white people are trying to understand and define their own freedom in relationship to Black people. It's not static. So in the case of one household, the Foxes, which is a small plantation household, and over the course of their slaveholding livelihood, they probably own about 2 enslaved women and an enslaved man, and then the children of those enslaved women, which will range between 4 to 5 children over time. And I'm using the mistress's diary to try to get a sense of how Black people in this household are moving in the world, and how they're experiencing their captivity, and how they're resisting it. And how they're creating mobility is the thing that I feel like is really important for Black people in this particular household. But it also allows me to see this white woman struggling with the limits of her own freedom, right? As she tries to manage the enslaved people in this household. And that she, as we know, white women often do, imagines a kind of freedom on these Black women that she doesn't think she has, right? And, you know, I think our instinct is to say, well, yeah, we know that white women weren't slaves of slaves, and that, but there is a part of me when I read about the women in her household, right? And how they stake out time with off the grid, time with their family, with the people they love, drinking their whiskey, whatever it is that they're doing, right? That there is, I argue, they are offering up an alternative vision of freedom, right? And it is it's a vision that white people can embrace, or it's a threat.
Yeah.
Right? That in some ways it's a threat to white people. Either like you need to be prepared to expand how you think about freedom, or you need to be prepared to fight. To keep it, you're gonna have to put locks on the doors, is what they do, right? You gotta you're gonna have to lock me in. And even if you lock me in, I'm gonna break the window and I'm gonna climb out. So that they are constantly testing where white people are willing, how white people are willing to imagine what's possible for Black people. And when white people resist, they continue to define space for themselves and create space.
Yeah. I want to kind of step back for a minute and think broadly about categories like citizenship. And I want to kind of break the mold in two different ways. One has to do with space and the other has to do with time. So the space question goes something like, you've been very, very, very careful to talk about Louisiana as a very particular place in North America with a history unlike any of the other states. On the other hand, I don't believe you'd be doing this work if you thought that this only pertained to Louisiana. Can you talk about the understanding you've come to about the Louisiana-ness of this project?
Well, I mean, there's, if it was, I love New Orleans. So I loved going to do my research there. So I might not have done this project. No, I'm just joking. But like, I do think there's something particular about Louisiana. And that there is something unique in this story that in some ways it couldn't have happened. Like in some ways, that kind of pre-Civil War moment happens in Louisiana because of that French and Spanish history, because of the number of Black people who come from Haiti. There's a whole mix that we don't get those Black regiments without the Haitian Revolution, right? And we don't get them anywhere else, right? In this formation before the Civil War. We don't get that Black people mustering into the Confederacy anywhere else, right? 2 regiments of free Black men mustering in, prepared to fight. So that there is something particular about this place and the time. But what I think brings Louisiana into the sort of larger narrative of American history and how we might think about freedom and citizenship is the Civil War, right? The Civil War in some ways, it makes Louisiana not the exception, right? But again, it's a place where a host of things are possible that aren't possible anywhere else in the South, right? Not just the Black regiments, but you have, that the Union Army comes in and sets up plantations because Black people haven't been emancipated, but they need them to work, right? So it becomes in some ways an experiment. Willie Lowe's says it's an experiment in South Carolina where white people gone, the white people left. You got abolitionists and missionaries like experimenting with Black labor in a way that in Louisiana, white people don't leave. Not, that a lot of loyal are there because they want to keep their plantations running, right? The ones who leave, the Union Army takes over. And what happens is you get it's the first place where you have a paid labor system in the context of slavery. So these people are still slaves, but Butler says, we're gonna pay y'all $10, because basically particularly Black women left on these plantations basically go on strike, because they're trying to keep them working. They ain't free, and they like, we ain't working no more, and we gonna hang the overseer. So the federal government has to intervene, and they're like, y'all gonna have to pay these people. I know they're slaves, but y'all gonna have to pay them. You're gonna have to give them some days off, and you're gonna have to give them health insurance. You gotta make sure their kids are taken care of. You're gonna have to give them some clothes. So there's this moment that we think about as kind of, post-Civil War. That Black people are sharecropping is set up in some ways. In Louisiana in '63, Black people are already negotiating labor contracts. We have this moment where the federal Army is saying, well, if you don't work on these plantations, if you decide you can't work for this person, you're gonna have to work in the public works or you're gonna be a vagrant. So that we can see already how Black labor and mobility is being policed, right? So that there's a model after the war, but we also know that Black people are already articulating how they imagine what being paid for their labor is going to look like and what they want, right? Yeah. They want education. They want, when I look at what Black people want, it's like, these are socialists. They want education, they want childcare, they want medical attention and health insurance in a sense. And that happens in Louisiana. And so that by the time we get those amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment, these are issues that are being fought on the ground in '63, '64 in Louisiana, where there's no emancipation. So again, what's unique about Louisiana is that it happens in the context of war, but then we're going to see it unfold
exactly
all across the South in the next decade, over the next decade.
Right. So that was my space question, was about Louisiana. The time question is just what you're getting to. You and I are paid to be able to think in terms of like 1863 was like it just was yesterday, right? most people aren't quite like that. Most people think 1863 was a long time ago. Can you talk a bit about how you explain to someone that actually 1863 was not such a long time ago, and if we're thinking about these big kind of glacial categories like freedom and citizenship, or maybe another way, a more kind of a focused way of asking the question is, how has the work that you've been doing on 1863, 64, 65 shaped the way that you think about the later period, like when you're teaching your civil rights class? What is the bearing of what you're learning about freedom in this context on the history that unspools over the next 3 and 4 generations?
I mean, it's funny because I feel like we just had one of our students, as you know, just defended her dissertation, Anna Dunsing, and she is thinking about sort of this long history of Black anti-fascism, right? And in thinking about my own work, it's like, well, what does Black freedom look like? And how do we understand it? And how has it changed over time, right? How has the category of citizenship changed over time, right? And that, we can hear Black people today use the language of freedom and talk about the limits of what's possible for Black people in the face of police violence, in the face of mass incarceration, in the face of disenfranchisement, in the face of unfair housing and underemployment. But yet we know that Black people have continued to make the argument for racial equality, have continued to make the argument for a more just and equitable democracy, right? And that comes out of not just 63, but I think 63, 64 are turning points, right? That when we get those amendments and we come out of Reconstruction, Black people have actually, with Republicans and their allies, have actually redefined citizenship, right? We now have birthright citizenship because of the arguments that Black people made about how do we define citizenship after Black people, enslaved people, have been emancipated, right? So again, sort of pushing for a more expansive definition, right? The who gets to vote, right? You know, white people weren't always like guaranteed the right to vote, right? So, you know, that 15th Amendment is also a moment that serves to expand what's possible, and that Black people are constantly trying to push the envelope, even as white supremacy, as we know, continues to remake itself and continues to try to undermine the rights and privileges that are extended to Black citizenship, right? So I think for me, it's about getting my students to understand that there's this longer arc, right? So, you know, when we talk about the civil rights movement, or we talk about the Black freedom struggle, right? That they're, you know, they really understand what the civil rights movement is. And as a historian, I can kind of do the chronology for them, right? But when we talk about the Black freedom struggle, there's no endpoint here.
Right.
Right? We could say 1619 is a start point, but you know, I would argue about that. But what does Black freedom look like, and how's it being articulated in Louisiana in 1832, right? When Black people also are invested, many of them, in the institution of slavery as a way to shore up their fragile freedom.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that it's not always static, it's not always the same, but that I would contend that a Black vision of freedom is more radical and more expansive and inclusive than what we understand as American freedom, right? Coming out of, you know, 1796.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That we understand that as white freedom.
Yes.
We understand it as white citizenship. And so if we take that for granted, then it means we actually have to define what Black freedom is and what racial equality looks like.
Yeah.
And that Black people are constantly trying to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. I want to invite our audience to submit questions either on the chat or in the Q&A. And here's a question coming in from our friend, Katie Lofton. Professor Feimster, thank you for your words and inspired unveiling of the research process. You mentioned that you need to, quote, read against the grain in order to find the experiences of Black lives. How do you do this with white authored documents? Is there another example you can teach us how you do this tough work, and perhaps to advise other teachers trying to help students think about what sources can do? Anything about which students must be mindful?
Right. Thank you, Katie, for that question. You know, I'm of two minds around this question. So I acknowledge that it is a method, right? This idea of reading against the grain. And it is, I think, a method that comes out of a turn in which historians were ready to find Black people in the archive, or ready to see them in the archive, right? And then it meant that, like, okay, now I see them. I see them in these slave ledgers. I see them in, this white woman's diary. I see them in the newspaper, but I'm seeing them through the eyes of their enslavers, or I'm seeing them through the eyes of someone who once me to understand them in terms that justify their enslavement, right? So you can acknowledge that. That doesn't require reading against the grain to kind of get a sense of how people justified slavery, or how people thought about Black people as racially inferior or less than. That's a kind of straight read that I feel like I can do as a scholar, like to understand how people are thinking and making arguments about how Black people should be treated. The sort of act of reading against the grain is recognizing that often, like sort of the gut level, is that you're writing about somebody's child, right? That like that is that, as far as I'm concerned, when I read as a kind of diary or entry in which somebody is being written about as if they are a slave, right? How do I reclaim their humanity? How do I reread? And part of that rereading isn't based on just what I imagine, because it can't be that. It's based on a skill set, right? As a historian who's read the historiography, right? So I can talk about freedom narratives and read against the grain and make an argument for that because I've read slave narratives, right? And because I've read and thought alongside scholars who've tried to help me understand a particular place and time, right? So then I have the tools when I'm reading that source, right? So that, when I read and I was like, the Black Native Guard, like, who are these people? Then I could go back and read the secondary literature and then come back to the military records and begin to kind of read against the narrative that the person who's writing is putting out. So that is what I say about what my argument about reading against the grain. But I also think there is a way of reading along, if I haven't said this, or reading alongside the text, right? So with my work on Celia, for example, I don't have any words that she's written. I have white people testifying in a court saying this is what she said to me, right? And so when they say, like, I could read against the grain about what they're saying Celia said, but I read that document along with what I know she did, that she killed this man. What I know to be true, she had 2 children by him and that he raped her, that the white people said he raped her. So how do I read those alongside what I know, right? So that there's a rub, right? I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that was beautiful.
But you said the pitfalls are what, the challenges, right?
Okay,
We can't know everything, Katie. We just can't. And so I have to tell my students, well, you have to accept what you can't know, and that there are the limits. The limits of the archives in your sources. So that's the pitfall, is to assume that you can know everything when in fact you can't.
Here's a question that I think is related. This is from your friend Tiana Williams. Thanks, Professor. This is more of a methodological process question. How do you contend with and write about the competing visions of freedom in Black Louisiana? I imagine some Black people are advocating for separatism, some are arguing for the state to be responsible, some want reparations, some don't. How do you weave competing visions of freedom into one as you're writing this project? This is a long way of asking of how do you write about multiplicity under the umbrella of Black freedom dreams?
This is a great question, Tiana. That's why I love thinking with you and alongside of you. It's a tricky one in the sense that, as my student, I'm always in context is everything, right? so that to understand competing visions, you have to understand the context in which the ideas and visions are being articulated, right? It actually matters. It actually matters. The freedom narrative that Jordan, for example, is articulating is in some ways quite different from the narratives of the sort of community, the kind of elite community of Black people who haven't been enslaved, right? And it's important for me to understand that he had spent the first 32 years of his life enslaved, so that then I could begin to make sense of why his vision looks the way it is, and why he's positioning himself the way that he does, right? And so context matters, and that I don't always see them as competing visions. In some ways, like accepting that there's no singular, and that there may be multiple visions that are not actually in competition with one another, right? But that are rooted in the fact that it's a Black woman's vision, right? Who has never been enslaved, but maybe it's been living, like, because Jordan marries a free Black woman eventually. His second wife is a free Black woman. And we're going to see their visions bump up against each other, because basically she inherits some enslaved people from her brother and their women. And she decides, and those women have been living as if they're free, right? And this Jordan's wife decides she's gonna sell them. She's selling them in the slave market, and she getting some money, right? But they sue her and they say, we've been living as free, you cannot re-enslave us, right? And it like gets splattered all over the news, and it's like right on the cusp of the Civil War. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. It's decided in 1961 that they're actually free. But in Jordan's name is on the like legal case. What he gonna do? He like, okay, because these Black people, they've been like, so he basically writes a letter to the newspaper. It says, I'm just married to this woman. I ain't trying to enslave these other women. Because by this point, he's actually made a name for himself as this drummer. And he's like making money, hand over fist, beating his drum in the streets as Jackson's drummer boy, right? So he's really has to protect his own freedom and the way people are thinking about him as a free Black person, right? So so when it becomes public knowledge that he may be operating, again, that's a moment where there's a competing vision. But there are moments when people are just imagining, have their own ideas rooted in a particular moment in context. So the Civil War, I love Fort Jackson case in many ways, because we're going to see Black men articulating their vision of citizenship, which is rooted in a particular kind of manhood. And you're going to see Black women articulating their vision that's rooted in a kind of particular kind of womanhood. And that sometimes they bump up against each other. And so I'm always trying to parse that and understanding in what context, what kind of context create competing visions, and which context do we just get multiple visions.
We're just about out of time, but let me ask you one more question. We've talked about citizenship, we've talked about freedom. One word that has not come up is democracy, which is different. And I'm curious what you think this work teaches about democracy in America. And you can turn that into a 19th century question or a 21st century question, kind of follow your instincts on that one. But I'm curious where this has led you to your own thinking about democracy in America.
I don't want to sound hyperbolic, I think was one of the words that came up today in Anna's defense and talking about kind of anti-fascism. Is democracy a myth in some ways, right? And I was thinking about many of the protests in which I've been involved in, where the chant is, "This is what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like." And I want to believe that, like, in researching and writing about Black people's claims for freedom and their vision and claim on the rights of citizenship, that in doing that, they're basically making the case that democracy is possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I believe, as much as I want to say it's a myth, I also believe that in the ideals of a democratic society, and that it's not a given, and that if we're not constantly fighting for it, insisting on it, holding our government and our neighbors accountable, then it doesn't exist, then it's a myth.
Right.
But it's not a given, and it is not static. And if we want it to work, we have to fight for it. And if we've learned anything, except, January 6th is a reminder, right? That it's not a given.
Right. And in fact, the ideal of democracy is renewed in the fight. It's renewed by the fight. I think of the great left-wing California lawyer, Carrie McWilliams, writing during the Depression, said that democracy is invigorated from the margins and from below.
Right.
And that, don't look to the White House if you want to understand democracy, look out in the streets. And I think that is certainly one of the lessons of your work. And it's very powerful when you were talking about the expansiveness of the Black freedom vision. It's a powerful reminder of how impoverished we've made ourselves by not attending to that tradition, and to think about Thomas Jefferson instead is just a tragedy in our own kind of our political vision and the tools that we have at our disposal. So thank you so much. This has been a beautiful hour, and I could listen to you for many, many hours more.
Well,
so
thank you for having me, Matt.
Thank you, Crystal Feimster. And I just want to remind everyone that next week, Laura Briggs from UMass Boston or UMass Amherst will be here to talk about her work on how all politics became reproductive politics. In the meantime, take good care of yourselves. Don't let your guard down. There are people who will tell you that the pandemic is over, and it's not. Be really careful out there. Take good care. And again, Crystal Feimster, thank you so much. It's really been a delight to talk with you this hour.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Take good care.